Why should you propagate for bonsai? There are benefits to growing your own bonsai, propagating your own trees. For me, it is the fun of the process. I enjoy propagation. If you prune a large maple, you might have a few hundred branches that you cut off, all of which can be used as a cutting. So you can, in one session, have a few hundred plants. Now, how can you afford to buy a few hundred plants or even airlayer a few hundred plants? Now, when I talk about propagation for bonsai, I'm thinking about 3 different methods. First one, by seed. Second, by cutting. Third, by airlayer. And each of these has a reason why you should use this technique or why not. I've been looking back at my videos, and many of my videos actually deal with propagation, and whether it is about growing a ginkgo from seed, an Arakawa maple from an airlayer, or the strident maple from seed. If you are in a hurry to get a show-worthy tree on your benches, then propagation might not be for you. All of these are results of propagation, and I have a good reason why I propagate lots of my trees myself, even though it probably is a lot more time consuming than just buying a big trunk in a store or going out and collecting a nice yamadori. Of course, there's a pro and a con towards self-propagation. Let's start with why you should not self-propagate bonsai. There's one fast method to get a good, decent trunk on your benches by propagation, and that's airlaying. Now, by airlayering, one of the things that you don't get immediately is a very good nebari. Developing the surface flare of your bonsai, even on an air-layered tree, will take you maybe 5 to 10 years. Only then you get the nice swelling with good solid root attachment. So if you're looking for a tree with a nice nebari, interesting features like this large, some old bark, then maybe propagation is not for you. Naturally, you can layer sometimes and then develop this nice root spread. But that brings me to a second reason why sometimes self-propagation is not the way to go. Not all species air layer equally well. Like this pine, you would not be able to air layer it all that easily. Pines are notoriously bad at growing roots on their old trunks. So air layering, if it works at all, it takes a very long time and is very unreliable. This tree, easily 25, 30 years in training, in a grower's field, or in a pot before it came to me. This of course brings me to the question, why should you propagate your trees yourself? And I've been thinking to myself, why do I do it? And to be honest, some of the reasons are I just like it. I enjoy having a seed, putting it in the ground and seeing it germinate and grow out into a tree. The same for cuttings. The idea of taking the growing tip of a tree and planting it in a pot, then seeing roots develop, and after a couple of months potting it up individually, I just love it. Which is also why I do it a lot, which is good for you, because I'm posting quite a few videos on propagation techniques for bonsai. Other reasons are, of course, of a more technical nature. There are benefits to growing your own bonsai by seed. Let's start with the first. The first, growing from seed. Now, there's some clear benefits, right? Seeds are plentiful. If you're growing a plant from your region, you can just go out in fall and you collect the seeds and you plant them up, stratify them where needed, and in spring, typically they come up and plants start growing. Now I have 1-year-old oak seedlings, 1-year-old ginkgo seedlings, a 2-year-old pine seedling, a 4-year-old Japanese maple seedling, and a 5 or 6-year-old Japanese maple seedling. And I think you already see one of the concerns. When you grow from seed, you never know how many seeds are going to germinate. So typically you collect a lot of seeds. In this pot there were 4 seeds, 3 of them germinated. In this pot there were 10 seeds, 3 of them germinated. This is actually unfair because this came from a tray where I planted 100 seeds and only 70 or so germinated. Japanese maple, germination rate 80-90% is a really good germination rate. So you always have to plant more than you need and you end up with a tray full of seedlings that you don't know what to do with or how to further treat it. But that's also, of course, why I have these videos. Now, a benefit from growing from seed, the full artistic control is of great benefit. Now look at this Japanese maple. I've been growing it for, I don't know, 8 or maybe 10 years. I grew it from a seed. And if you look here at this trunk line, it is twisted and contorted in a way that you'd never find in a commercial grower or in trade. So this tree was grown specifically for bonsai by me. And if you just look at this tree, the shape, I love it. Note, it is not very fat, and that's on purpose. I've only grown this in a pot. And as a result, a very nice root flare is starting to develop here at the base of the trunk. But that's not my main aim. My main aim is to keep it nice and slender and tall with lots and lots of character. I want to say thank you. Thank you for subscribing. If you like my content, I love it if you drop me a line, leave me a comment. I try to answer, but sometimes there's so many comments, I am a couple of months behind. Then, if you have any questions about this video and how to propagate, or if there are species where you don't know how to propagate and I don't have video on it yet, drop me a line below. And otherwise, just let me know whether you like these videos or not. Actually, have you not subscribed yet? Is this the first time to my channel? Welcome to my channel. And pop me a message. Subscribe if you actually like other videos as well. And see you here next time. If you decide to grow from seed, keep in mind one thing. These take very long to mature. These oaks, they're probably 15 years away from entering a bonsai pot. In fact, to really develop these, I should plant them out in a grower's field and just let them grow for a couple of years to fatten up. Otherwise you'll end up with very, very thin plants, which are really not all that interesting for bonsai. However, it does give you the opportunity to, like this pine, if I just let it grow, it will be fairly straight. But I can wire it out now, give it an interesting shape, make sure that the lowest buds stay alive, and just have one big sacrifice branch, and I have very good compact low branching. This is something that takes time, it takes years, and normally if you go to a bonsai store you'll find trees where they have done this for you. They've saved you maybe 5 or 10 years of growing it out yourself, but you are then limited to what they have on offer. But most importantly, why I think it is important to grow from seed is a positive and a negative at the same time. The weather is really unstable, so you'll see the light coming up and down as the sun and the clouds. Well, actually the sun stays where it is and the clouds move in front of the sun. But bear with me while you watch this video. I know the exposure is not going to be great. And what I'm talking about is genetic variety. What you see here, this is a seedling from seeds that were collected from a normal, regular Japanese maple. However, the growing tips always are bright red. This is grown in relative shade, and I've been trying for years to see whether the location it is grown in alters the color. And it doesn't. Every time this plant starts growing, it is nice and pink. And with normal regular Japanese maple, it's not that reliable and not so bright. So this probably germinated from a seed that has been fertilized from a Japanese maple, a green maple, where I collected the seed, but it crossed with another variety. And with that, I now have a new variety. And the same actually goes for this one. And this one is really, really interesting. If you look at these leaves, you see that this pattern is that of the more, deeply cut maple varieties. However, it was collected from an Arakawa Japanese maple. You can actually see that here at the trunk. The bark of this maple is very, very pronounced. In fact, it is a cork bark variety, but with very, very deeply cut leaves. This is a new variety, and in fact this is one that I'm going to have registered and commercially propagated, because nobody has a maple like this. So using the genetic variability of Japanese maple, but also of, for instance, Satsuki azaleas, means that you get a wide variety in colors, in growth forms, in flowering shapes, and that is what we're after when we're going for a seed-based propagation. That is, however, a problem if you have a tree where you really, really like the traits. If you say, well, I like this leaf color, I like the needles, or I like the flowers, then what do? Well, that is when you then go into the vegetative propagation methods. So vegetative propagation has one massive, massive benefit over seed-based grown plants, and that is they're exactly the same as the parent plant. Two of them in this video, one is cutting, and one is air layering, and the pros and cons. So this is a Deshoyo maple. Deshoyo is a variety that has a really crimson leaf growth in spring, and also in summer the new branches that come out, if exposed to enough sun, are a dark red. Now this plant is probably a direct descendant of the Deshoyos that were propagated 50 or 100 years ago, because it can only remain a Deshoyo maple if it is propagated by cutting. And that is because then it keeps this unique trait of very, very dark red leaves. That is why I grow lots of things from cutting or from airlayer. Let's dive into growing from cuttings. One of the important characteristics that you might want to preserve is whether it's a male or female plant. This yew was grown from a cutting, and I grew it from a cutting because the parent plant, the mother plant, was female, and therefore this plant is growing the characteristic red fruits that you only find on, of course, a female plant. Typically, if you buy them in trade, they are male plants because the seeds are very poisonous. Actually, the whole plant is very poisonous. So this was propagated about 3 years ago, and you can see right now already there is fruits on there. And that is another benefit of vegetative propagation. The plants typically, if they're already of flowering age, when you take the cuttings or the air layer, are ready for fruiting or flowering the next year. Another benefit is of course just volume. If you prune a large maple, you might have a few hundred branches that you cut off, all of which can be used as a cutting, so you can in one session have a few hundred plants. Now, how can you afford to buy a few hundred plants or even air layer a few hundred plants? Growing from seed a few hundred is possible, but then they're all different. Cuttings then really is a way to go. And of course, just like with seedling grown plants, once they have rooted, cutting grown plants can be directly shaped in interesting shape, which saves you cutting back to create movement. I haven't done that yet on this yew. The reason is quite simple, because yew remains flexible for a very long time. So in the first 2 or 3 years I can still shape the main trunk, or I can do what other people do and just let this whip grow out very strong and use one of the lower branches later on and just cut it back. So what do you do if you want a bigger tree straight away? And that is actually a downside that both seedling grown and cutting grown plants have in common. Typically you start off with very, very thin young material, and for some species that's not a problem. Some of them will fatten up very quickly, like a trident maple. If you put it in the full ground and you have a good climate, then getting 5-6 centimeters, 2 or 3 inches in a few years is possible. However, in colder climate that might be a little bit more difficult, but then you can grow things like a linden tree or a willow tree, and they will fatten up very fast. And of course also elm trees, like this one. If I put this in the ground, it will become that size in 3 to 5 years. But it does take a little bit of time. Well, it's simple. Then you look for a bigger tree, you find an interesting part of that tree, and you use air layering techniques to create a new tree out of this. This is one of the reasons why you do air layering. Air layering provides you the option to grow roots on the main trunk, cut off the main trunk, and then you have a completely new plant. The process takes about 4 to 6 weeks for most broadleaf trees, but for conifers it can take up to a year. So that is a downside of this process. I have 1, 2, 3 branches for air layering, and that will take the whole summer from one plant. Cutting ground would go considerably faster, but then I'd have not such a nice tree. So you can actually develop your bonsai on the main tree, which aids in developing a bigger trunk. And then at a certain point say, okay, now I'm going to air layer it off, and you have almost an instant bonsai. The only thing that you then need to focus on is the nebari and the ramification. But the main trunk line, taper, diameter, that's already there. Now, second reason why you might want to use air layering for propagation of bonsai is a problem that you often find with trees that you buy in trade. Trees that you buy in a commercial plant store typically have 2 things in common. If it is an interesting variety, then they're often grafted upon the regular form, particularly Japanese maple. You often find grafted upon the normal green maple, or they have a horrible nebari. And both of these things you can fix by air layering. Now you can say air layering is then not really propagation, but I disagree, because you're growing a new root system and you're cutting it off, so you're creating 2 plants out of one, you're propagating. This is a Japanese maple variety. I think it's Nishikigawa. It's a cork bark variety, and this was on its own, and this was grafted upon the green maple. So when I got it, the first year I planted it in a container, I let it grow, and the second year I layered it off. So now it is on its own roots, and the benefit is that the cork bark that you get on the main trunk continues in the roots. And for bonsai, you don't want this unpleasant difference between the main trunk and the roots having a different bark structure. So that's a good reason for air layering of plants. Air layering can result in a very nice base for a good root spread. Lots and lots of roots at the same level to choose from to build your nabari. Key is keep the roots covered during this process so they all stay alive and can fatten up. And as said, you can air layer very, very big branches. Look at this. This branch has not thickened a lot since I layered it off 8 or 9 years ago. It is a little bit unhealthy. There's a mildew on it, but this is a pretty decent sized bonsai. So you can get really thick branches off a tree. The thickest I've seen, about that wide on an elm, but I'm pretty sure you can do better. If you're growing from seed, often people find it very difficult to germinate the seed. So that's why I always recommend, if you're growing from seed, plants that are local, look around. Keep your eyes open and you might just find trees growing. 1-year-old seedlings can often be found underneath the tree in between the litter, or like this little oak. This just came in my box of old substrate and I just planted it up like that. So there you have it. What sort of methods do you have to propagate for bonsai and why you should use them or not? And if you now want to learn more about how to do it, I could recommend having a look at how to take air layers, or maybe you want to just understand more about taking cuttings. Interesting question, of course, is these I grew by taking the roots of an elm and potting them up. And then they sprouted leaves. What do you call this? This was Jelle growing bonsai. It was a pleasure and see you next time. And until then, keep growing bonsai.